Hi, everyone. I'm Thank you for joining us this morning. Uh, Coming live from the West Coast. I wanted to introduce Rowan Curran, who is our an analyst from Forrester Research, for this webinar with DataRobot. Rowan, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks so much. Great to be here with everyone today. My name is Rowan Kern. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester. I cover a bunch of things under the data science, AI, machine learning aegis, but specifically I look at the leading edge of foundation models, agentic AI, and AI ML platforms. And I'm really excited to be here with y'all today talking about these topics.
Awesome. And I am Venki Veeraraghavan. I'm the Chief Product Officer for DataRobot, and I've been happy to have this conversation. Rowan, just get started. I wanted to get your take on sort of agentic transformation. I know you've written a bunch of material in terms of research on how things are going with agentic and the sort of the maturity of of customers as they move through this agentic sort of adoption.
Yeah, so I think it's been a really interesting journey for a lot of companies over the past, I would say, 12 to 18 months. Throughout I would say the middle and latter half of 2025, we really saw most companies who are starting out with agentic really starting to, just get on the journey in terms of applying it to automating individual tasks and augmenting end-to-end workflows, and really applying in a more tactical and kind of low-hanging fruit type of targeting for the use cases. And what that led to was, a large amount of adoption in some contexts and some circumstances. So you saw a lot of customer service, employee support, these types of use cases. And they became very widespread. But when we looked at sort of the breadth of the type of use cases, especially coming into this year, we really saw what almost amounted to stagnation in terms of the breadth and types of use cases. But that has started to expand and really break out of these kind of initial V1 use cases. So today we're starting to see folks really move beyond just kind of this individual process support and tactical enablement to starting to see what are kind of the broader effects of using agentic AI and AI more broadly. And a good example of this, I think, is in marketing and content creation teams. So those are one of the first sets of folks that were enabled with Gen AI tools and stuff like that to help create copy and deliver campaigns. And now they're starting to use agentic AI to help automate market research and things like that. But one of the impacts of those teams having the capability to create and deliver more content is that their downstream teams now need to be able to ingest that and figure out how to apply that within the market. So when you were enabling folks with agentic AI and AI overall, you can see significant benefits to the folks that are actually using the tools, but then you also have to think about how are you going to not create further bottlenecks up or downstream from that enablement. And so what we're starting to see is folks really looking at the space overall and not just taking a use case by use case approach to their agentic rollouts, but starting to think at a broader level around the whole value chain and how they can actually start to re-engineer this a little bit. So thinking about, what are they doing about sort of their product design process, their product feedback process, now that they're perhaps using, an AI-enabled agent to collect customer feedback, to process it, and then to, give that feedback to the product development team. But really, that's, I would say, the leading edge of enterprises are the ones who have started to get there at this point. And I think that's a big chasm that a lot of folks have to cross, is how do we get from these more operational benefits to the more strategic benefits that we're all looking for.
That's very interesting. We've seen the same thing as we talk to customers and engage them on sort of building agents. We've definitely seen the same sort of transition from the co-pilots to sort of LOB agents to sort of more strategic transformation. One thing that's been very interesting about this transition is this idea of sort of role collapse and really sort of like going native with this agentic transformation that really sort of focusing on not just automating an existing workflow, but really sort of looking at multiple roles that are working together in the
Mhm.
enterprise, sort of having humans just as middleware, as they call it, and then sort of having agents sort of think about how to make that thing work. Have you seen examples or ideas on how sort of people have gone agent native?
So I think we're pretty early stages for most enterprises to be going fully agent native. But if we are, I think we can see the beginnings of it in particular departments at enterprises. And I think one of the places that we can see it most prevalently today is in the software development and IT organizations. So I think, for anyone who has been following the space, it's been very obvious that things like Codex, Claude Code, some of these other tools are becoming very, very prevalent and used, relatively ubiquitously at this point in time. And that, is not just because the coding tools themselves are very good and very precise, but because most of these are actually coordinating sets of agents that actually operate underneath them. So in the software development world, we're actually sort of transitioning into a space where we have most of our or many of our employees actually being a combination of a worker with more traditional tools, but also an agent supervisor across a number of their different subtasks. And I think that's one of the new nuances of the sort of workforce transition that wasn't necessarily uh, precisely anticipated a couple of years ago. I think there's been a lot of challenges around how do we do talent pipelines, how do we actually bring people up who are just starting out in the workforce and upskill them into the agentic world. But I don't think in past years we really had the conception that it was going to be uh, a potential job for entry level folks to coordinate these large swarms of agents on behalf of other parts of the team. So I think one thing we've also started to see is the potential for newer like entry level developer folks to basically be the stewards of a bunch of well curated agents for the rest of the team that will help them upskill and get aligned with the rest of the team, and then they can start to use more of these free-form coding agents as they start to move farther up. But I think what that means is also that the person who is doing that development, their job role starts to change. And one big way that we've seen that the job role start to change, and I think a way that it has not been talked about quite as much, is that a lot of data science skills now need to come into the developer world. So testing and evaluation of agents is a big problem for pretty much everybody in the space. And a lot of the techniques for how to overcome some of the challenges with automation and evaluation is going to need to come from the data science world. So, for example, ensemble modeling and ensemble testing is very familiar to machine learning engineers. But when you talk to an application developer, you're like, why would I design 6 different iterations of the application and then see which one is actually producing the most accurate output? That's not normally how I design an application, but that is the type of thinking that needs to come into how you're actually building and developing these applications. So I think we're going to be seeing a further role collapse between developers and data scientists, which we've already started to see, over the past like 5, 6 years. But it's going to accelerate even further, and there's going to be a greater need to kind of combine these the cognitive tool sets of each of these roles as well.
No, that's fascinating. I think it's that certainly developers sort of development has been completely transformed, and I think everyone's sort of going through that. I think it's interesting that now you'll have data science and development. We're also seeing, I guess, maybe uh, a a way to think about this is sort of like as you think about different kinds of transformations, agents are a huge disruption, and sort of as you think about going agent native, there's two kinds of ways to think about it. One is um, you're taking things you're already doing before and then going agent native. That's
Mm.
one sort of idea. The other one is like allowing the disruption to allow you to do things that had never been done before. And maybe I'll just sort of use an example that's really helped me think through it. um, when the internet came, Amazon sort of reinvented commerce, right? We were still buying and selling things,
Mhm.
but Amazon sort of redid sort of how to do commerce at, taking the internet as its core principle. And then on the other side, the same in internet disruption, you can do something completely new, right? Things that cannot be done before. Things like Google search or Facebook.
Mhm.
Have you seen this kind of sort of? I know it's not broadly in production or things like that, but have you seen examples of this sort of like either of these techniques sort of go at it? Because we've been sort of working with customers, helping them sort of use this metaphor to actually find out where they can go do stuff.
Yeah, so I would say that most of the use cases that I see fall into the first category that you described and somewhat into the second category, but not in terms of like, coming out with the iPhone for the first time or something like that. It's not that level of step change. What I'm seeing though is folks that are able to attack problems within their enterprise they've never been able to attack before. And I think a prime example of this is teams that typically were not able to reach whatever level of productivity they needed. Whether it's development teams, marketing teams, content creation teams, finance teams, whoever it is. And so they needed to rely heavily on, outside augmentatory resources and stuff like that. And those folks are now able to, meet the SLAs of their organization. They're able to, actually get the content production and the overall workflows executed in the time and at the quality that they need by just leveraging their internal capabilities, which has enabled them to then start thinking about, okay, how can we start to, maybe produce more interesting products on top of this? Another example of this is, I've seen in several organizations that are responsible for publishing information to their clients and to their partners in some type of way for safety and compliance reasons and stuff like that. Several of these companies, a logistics company and a content company are two examples, were not ever able to kind of meet the volume and the quality of requests that was demanded by their SLAs, even though they were releasing these. And so that was causing them, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of losses around this, every week. And because of their agentic workflows, they were basically able to produce the information at the volume that they needed to, and have human experts review with the human in the loop that we always need to actually validate that content before it went out. But essentially, they were able to eliminate this like large source of waste in their business that they would have never been able to attack before. But what I haven't seen, necessarily quite yet, is someone who is like completely reorganized the way that they do their product development, their product construction and delivery, their customer service and support, and then that whole loop to deliver some, completely net new step change type of process. Now, I think we're starting to see the beginnings of this in some places on the consumer side. So I think, the early capabilities in the agentic commerce space, buying through some of like the consumer chat tools and stuff like that. That's, a bit of like a net new way of like doing this interaction. But I think, at least from my perspective, I'm still waiting for, what is the, brand new idea that is enabled by this stuff. And I think one of the challenges is that there's things that like seem like they might be really good ideas. Like I'm going to have an agent that is going to automate, XYZ part of my business, and then is going to be able to identify new opportunities I never knew existed and go and execute them. Agentic systems are not reliable enough to do that type of thing at this point in time. So I think, there's a lot of imagination, especially coming from like the hobbyist community and stuff like that, where it's a little bit less control, a little bit less anxiety about this stuff that is pushing imaginations forward. But the reality of what can be built is a little bit different. And I think, the whole open claw excitement is a great example of this. It's fantastic for the hobbyist community, but, it was not necessarily appropriate for most enterprise contexts in the way that it was initially developed.
Yeah, no, I think OpenClaw is it's obviously captured our imagination, but we've seen NVIDIA release something to help it be more enterprise. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think the
Yeah.
core idea is, I think, definitely very exciting, and lots to be done there. Maybe I'll just reflect on one thing on sort of, we've had customers who have really sort of thought about how to change sort of related functions. I think sort of riffing off the same idea that you had around data science and developer. But it's been sort of more like mostly the planning function is one of the big things that a company does, which is like how to plan, and allocate resources and people and money. They're thinking about like sort of doing. Obviously, they do forecasting to figure out where to go. They've been thinking about how do you optimize for a given outcome. They've been thinking about doing a lot of what if type things, and that's really sort of taking multiple sort of departments of work to really sort of help a planner sort of get a full view of this. And that has been a very sort of popular topic for a lot of people to say like, hey, look, how do I really reimagine what used to be quite a manual process with lots of individual tools, and then sort of pulling together to sort of constrain and sort of build a more agentic experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the entirety, like, the planning space as well as the broader like logistics, supply chain management space, I think that is one of the richest areas for future agentic opportunity. I think there's obviously been a ton of automation work that's been done in that space around intelligent document processing and stuff like that over the past years, and now I think with more focus and more adaptation of the foundation models, they are quite good at understanding more complex, purchase orders, things like that would have to be sort of manually compared in the past. And I think one additional advantage of agentic systems, though I think this still has to come up in a bit in terms of maturity is the ability for them to more organically link these different systems so that you can have a broader perspective on how you're actually doing your enterprise resource planning. And I think that also speaks to me, something that I talk about all the time, which is that, your underlying, data management and retrieval layer is everything for your agentic strategy. Like the process control, all that type of good stuff, that is great and that's essential. But if you don't have the data and context piece first, you're not going to be able to actually deliver results. And I think that's, one thing for enterprises to really think about is it's not just thinking about, okay, how do I get all my documents together? How do I assemble all these things? But how do I actually start to think about, okay, can I pull information, using an agent or, typical API call out of my ERP system and then have some agentic reasoning look at my purchase orders, my contracts with my suppliers, and see what matches up, what doesn't, and then derive some action for a human to take. And I think there's a huge amount of potential there. And I think it's actually untapped in a lot of enterprises today. I think that's an area that has not typically been as acknowledged or encouraged towards AI innovation as some other areas of the business. So I think this is actually an area where there's opportunity for those folks to shine.
Awesome. I'm going to sort of gently move from sort of thinking of the use cases and sort of building them and sort of looking at them. And I think I'm going to sort of again pull the thread on what you started with OpenClaw. You sort of mentioned that OpenClaw, as it stands, is sort of not ready for enterprise use. But maybe just let's talk a little bit about sort of your thoughts on what does it take to take, even if you imagine an agent like this and you talked about, hey, look, they're not quite reliable enough. Like, what does it take to take even a good idea and an agent that a developer's built and sort of get it into production and sort of really sort of think about, how do you run your business on this new technology, especially for something that's mission critical and I'd say, not optional. You're not just sort of getting some better
Yeah.
advice or getting a better email. You really are saying, like I'm going to run claims processing. I'm going to sort of do these much more interesting, deep, sort of mission critical workflows.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things within this. And the first thing is to recognize that not everything about your enterprise and not everything about a workflow needs to be powered by a foundation model, needs to be agentic overall. And so one thing that I've seen as I've been doing a lot of recent interviews with practitioners at large enterprises around how they're building agents is that there's typically a sort of decisioning process that happens before you actually go out and develop the agent flow around, okay, what does this workflow look like overall, and which part of it could benefit from having a foundation model, reason about the next step in the process, but which part might just need to have a typical decision tree based upon a customer's profile or something like that. And how do you actually balance between different levels of autonomy and agency within the overall flow? And I think that's a critical part of really being able to build and scale these things effectively. Now, I think if you're looking at it kind of more broadly, what we see also is that there's a need to have deterministic guardrails and what sometimes are called agent constraints, in addition to having more typical context engineering and controls on the model itself within the prompt. What we've seen is that folks are now basically building layers around the model to kind of direct its behavior and to have it recheck itself so that the overall flow has a higher level of accuracy. And so as I mentioned, one way of doing that is deterministic controls. We're also seeing more and more folks implement multi-agent systems that have some type of either supervisor agent that is kind of checking the work of the underlying flow. Some folks are building was like a security guardian agent that is kind of checking security of how things are going. But essentially, it requires breaking down problems or breaking down the flow into sort of more atomic pieces, and also applying both foundation model driven guardrails and constraints as well as the more deterministic ones. And aside from the deterministic ones having the greater level of precision around specifically what you're trying to catch. So for example, like if you have like a regex after the output of a model and you're trying to catch the URLs, that's always going to catch that. But if you have a language model, it's like, hey, can you never allow URLs in your output? Then it will probably not allow that, but there may be some cause in the prompt or something like that that causes it to generate a URL because of some prompt injection attack or something like that. But then there's also the aspect of the performance of the agent itself. And I think this is something that most folks aren't necessarily, they'll think about in the development stage, but they don't really, consider the overall impact on performance of having, multiple language models in a flow and how you might actually reduce that latency introduced by the multiple language models. And one way you can do that is think about particular steps in, an overall process flow and whether, you need a language model to reason about what the next step is, or whether the actual next step is always going to be one of three specific options, and then you can just have, decision tree or whatever else in there. So I think there's that aspect of really knowing how much agency you need to apply and in what circumstance. And that also, aside from, coming out with kind of a better behaving agent, that's going to make it a lot easier to test and validate the behavior of the agent, which is so crucial, in the circumstances that we're talking about with regulated or, compliance-based releases. And, one thing that we've seen in the testing space here is that there's no really good standardized way to scale automated testing of agents. And so particularly if you're working in a heavily regulated environment, something that requires a lot of subject matter expertise, you're going to need to have a lot of humans in the loop to test and evaluate this thing. And if you are taking an approach where you are minimizing the amount of points where there could be, some foundation model sending things off the rails, is going to keep a bit in control, a fairly significant testing cost that needs to go into these things.
Uh, no, that's right. I think no, it's funny. Like we're back to when we started with agents Gen AI. We thought the single model will just get so smart it'll do everything. It turns
Mhm.
out even with humans, not one person doesn't know everything, and it's not super
Mhm.
smart. So I think we're sort of going back to, hey, look, let's break the problem down into smaller pieces, and then let's make sure that we test each one of those things, and make sure that the individual pieces are working, and then sort of the broader result is working. So yeah, no, I think that is a key technique, and I think like the technologies like MCP and A to A and other sort of like and even skills, they're
Mhm.
all sort of helping us sort of break down the problem and not letting just the LLM, which can hallucinate, sort of try to imagine how to solve the problem entirely.
Totally agree. I think just on the MCP point, I think that's a really good example of sort of how in this space we thought we could just kind of put everything in one place and then just point the system at it and everything would be great. And what I've seen for people deploying MCPs is that, it's okay to have like kind of a generalized MCP, but if you want, an agent to be executing a specific process in a particular way, you need to build in, kind of specific tooling within the MCP server to execute particular workflows. And I think that's, one interesting thing in the space overall is that I think, the previous story of machine learning and AI and analytics, from the past until like 2021 was we have these very narrow models that we need to expand the behavior of in order to get them, to be more effective. And now it's all right, we have these very broad models. We need to actually get them to do this specific thing for us always, every time. And that's like a very different proposition in terms of how you think about and develop these things.
Uh, Fascinating. So I think it's sort of it's good to sort of see some of the old lessons come back. Um, Maybe I was change a little bit on sort of the work that people are doing, or I'd say companies are spending a lot of money, sort of like acquiring GPUs and infrastructure, and and I think for a while there was this big GPU rush in terms of like just companies getting it because it was such a constrained sort of a commodity. Have you seen sort of how but they're still sort of working on even as you mentioned sort of getting the value and getting the strategic sort of ROI from this thing. How have you seen sort of the conversation change? And I think especially we started with AI sort of being almost completely a cloud conversation, but we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
huge amounts of spend outside the hyperscalers. Sort of how have you seen sort of the hardware and infrastructure, and obviously coming off last week from GTC, how have you seen sort of the infrastructure play change relative to sort of getting ROI and getting these sort of the final value from agents and GPUs?
Yeah, I think that this is still an unfinished story right now. I think similar to, it's one of these things where I think what we thought was going to be true in, late 2022, early 2023 has really changed significantly. And what I'm seeing now is that a lot of organizations, early on wanted to, run their own models on their own like hardware, whether it was in their virtual private cloud or whether it was, on premise or whatever it is. And what I saw subsequent to that was most companies didn't actually want to take on the technical overhead of managing these GPU clusters, replacing them, all this type of stuff, unless you were a very specialized large enterprise that like had specific dedicated need for this. And so throughout, I would say 24 and into 25, I saw a lot of folks, moving their agent building and their inferencing onto, various cloud services in order to obfuscate the complexity of actually managing the model under the hood. And I've seen that continue, but I have started to see a much greater interest in deploying models on premise and farther out to the edge. And I think that's coming from less so the models like per se, like getting smaller and much, much, much more appropriate for the edge, as it is coming from enterprises getting more familiar with how to build and work with these things overall. And so I'm starting to see some movement back towards, VPCs and onto the data center, but I would say there's still a tremendous amount of energy for inferencing in the cloud and for building in the cloud. And what I'm seeing overall is, we were already talking about we don't see, one model doing all these things. What I see at most organizations is they're taking a hybrid approach to how, they're using models like in different model families. And that can be within a single application, or that can be, across, different parts of the organization. So you might have, let's say, some, large asset, if you're like an oil and gas company or something like that, that is running on a derrick out there somewhere. And there, you might always say, okay, we're going to run, XYZ open source model because we need to run it out there and we can't afford to ever have, a latency or whatnot. But then in another circumstance, you might say, all right, we're only going to use, whatever proprietary model because we know that it performs this way for code and we need to have that level of capability for how we're actually executing. So I think moving forward, we're going to see enterprises take more deliberate decisions about whether they are inferencing to the cloud or inferencing on premise. And I think a couple of things that need to happen around that are there needs to be further work done on making it easier for the typical IT organization to manage these clusters on premise and to deal with them. And also for there to be an easier way to align and focus these models. So doing instruction tuning, distillation, post-training tuning, so that is actually cost efficient to do the type of work on these models that you would then actually want to put them on premise for. So I think there's movement back, but there's some additional kind of technology advancements that really need to happen to push this farther forward. And the last thing that I'll say on this is that there's definitely uh, an impetus towards, or I guess a bias towards having the AI inferencing as close to your data as possible. And I think, that makes sense in a lot of circumstances, but I think there's also, something to be considered around the fact that we're having a lot of advancements in terms of the local memory storage. So Google made an announcement last week. NVIDIA has been talking about, I think it's called their context data management. It's essentially a new way of managing memory on the chip. So that whole part of the conversation could diminish as well. But I think overall, if you're an organization that has data that is held in the VPC or is on premise and whatnot, at this point, I would, look at some type of AI gateway that managed inferencing to the cloud if you want to use the kind of the frontier models. And if you have a robust organization on your IT side, then look at inferencing models, in your own org. But otherwise, I would say lean on the cloud providers as much as possible. Because I think one thing to also think about there is, if it moves to, if there's some like new, more efficient way of inferencing the model, that's going to be hard for your team to necessarily implement. Like if there's new way of like quantizing the model or whatever it is, the cloud providers will handle that for you. I mean, you can take away that layer of complexity.
I wanted to sort of, I think I totally agree on sort of like the interest in going on-prem and sort of like the investment there. I think one of the things that is sort of helping is in DataRobot, for instance, we are building a lot of this functionality in the platform that allows people not to sort of go into raw, sort of like pick up a Hugging Face model, do the distillation or the quantization, and then sort of run and scale a model. Like, having sort of things like NIMs sort of fully hardened and being able to one-touch deploy and scale, and then also do things like, one of the other things is, getting utilization of the GPUs is relatively hard. It's relatively
Hmm.
easy to do that in the cloud, but on-prem is hard. And so we have things like multi-tenancy that really sort of says, hey, look, this same Nemotron model or Quen model or GPT-OSS model, it can be inference, but it can be used by multiple applications and multiple agents to actually
Mhm.
get the utilization up. I think the platform tooling is going to be super important for helping the like enterprise ready, has the great use cases and support, and also and gives people open function that allows to say, hey, look, different kinds of models, and a gateway that says I can use external models or sort of open source models.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point about the utilization of GPUs internally. I think that's something I've seen with organizations, especially when they are thinking about, potentially wanting to train their own model. Um, I have conversations with them and then they don't necessarily think about, okay, now that we've trained the model, we have all these GPUs, like how are we actually going to reapply this investment to get the most out of it that we can? So yeah, I definitely think that that's, an additional layer of sort of operational management that needs to be considered by organizations who are doing this, so that their IT organization isn't kind of left holding the bag around that.
Awesome. I think we're just sort of coming to close almost. I want to leave some time for us to sort of pick up some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
let's
right.
do it. Hi, Venki. Hi, Rowan. We have quite a few good questions in here. I think we have time for just a couple. So Alex is asking, do you offer an orchestration platform that measures agent performance, governance, and security?
I guess
That's
I'll
to
take that as
Venki.
I'll take that as a platform provider. Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. DataRobot, we have this thing called the Agent Workforce Platform. It's sort of really an end-to-end platform that allows you to go from sort of building and evaluating the model. Rowan talked a lot about sort of breaking down the problem and having the different pieces into sort of manageable chunks, and then being able to evaluate each individual component, and then more important, evaluate the whole behavior of the agent. So things like how do you do red teaming? How do you do correctness evaluation? How do you do tool call accuracy? Sort of all of those sort of put together is important. And then just as we mentioned in the conversation, then taking that agent and putting it into production in a secure way. Doing things like authentication, doing scaling, multi-tenancy. Really sort of saying, hey, look, what does it mean to run basically a distributed system at scale in a secure manner? So sort of pulling all that together is sort of what we do as a platform. And then the final thing we do is really sort of do it on your own terms, which is like, every single customer has a different needs and different preferences and standards. And so some people might say, we only use open source models. Some people might say, I'm totally, using Anthropic and I want to use AWS's version versus, version that's coming out of Microsoft or Azure. We give you the option to sort of like say, how do I pick the tool chain, the frameworks, whether it's LangChain or Nemo Agent Toolkit or Crew. So doing that on your own terms. So I think so the platforms do exist, and we believe that it's a super important way to sort of really focus on what is important for the enterprise and not sort of really focus on what's below the waterline, the boilerplate of how do you run a large scale distributed system, a Kubernetes cluster. You want to leave that to a platform vendor and then sort of really focus on the behavior of the agent.
And then a question from Colin that, Rowan, we can start with you for this one. He shared an HBR article that says new evidence indicates that AI might actually intensify work rather than reducing it. To what extent is this true for agentic AI?
So I haven't read that specific study, so I'm not going to comment on it directly here. But what I will say is that there is definitely, like, there's obviously a burden to learning a new technology so that you can use it optimally. And I think one of the things that is challenging about, the Gen AI space and now the agentic space is that the pace of change is so fast, is that there's really no opportunity to kind of get comfortable in your current flow of work and before you have to start rethinking how you're, doing the workflow again. And so I think that there's definitely, the potential to lose productivity by kind of getting stuck in unproductive loops around agentic AI. And I think a good example, like this comes from, I think, bad people governance, I'm going to say. Even like that sounds a little harsh, but it really comes from the fact that if you aren't actually directing people towards the right usage of this stuff, they can spin their wheels. They can, spend a lot of time in the same way that if you kind of, if you gave somebody a QWERTY keyboard, before they'd ever used one of those, they would be spending a lot of time like touch typing and stuff like that instead of, being able to just blast right through. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a fair number of employees who, haven't been able or haven't been given the proper, understanding and framing around how to use these tools. And especially if you look at kind of the broad-based like generally use copilots and stuff like that, not specifically like Microsoft Copilot, but the Copilot type of thing. That's an area where we see, a lot of folks, building their own like sub agents and stuff like that. But is it really delivering a tremendous value for those folks to be building agents themselves? I think that's still, a question right now. And I do think that there needs to be more discipline in enterprises around who actually should be the one who is building the agent itself versus who is the person who's like, oh, hey, team member, can you go build this for me? I think an example of this is I see a very non-zero amount of like high-level managers and execs like building agents themselves when they should be having, some member of their staff like put something together so that they can, immediately know how they need to do all their interactions next week rather than spending, 4 hours doing it themselves. So I think there's definitely people who are losing productivity by doing this, but I don't think it's because of the agents themselves. I think it goes back to, the kind of sort of perennial problem with technology that if you don't actually bring the humans along in the use of technology, whether it's a hammer or a keyboard or an AI, you're not going to get, a good level of return on the usage of that technology. And again, in agentic and Gen AI more broadly, it's exacerbated because this stuff moves so quickly that it's very hard to like become comfortable with the skill set, but also there's nobody who's been doing this for 10 years ahead of you who's going to tell you exactly what to do. So we're all kind of like learning and co-inventing together. Sorry, that was probably a longer response than you wanted, Colin, but yeah, I think it's you definitely do see that it does reduce work, but I think that's more a consequence of how you're actually implementing and using it rather than the technology itself.
We have another question that kind of speaks to the other end of that. So you talk about this workforce of agents. As that workforce grows, how do you stop it from just becoming a digital version of too many cooks in the kitchen? And maybe Venki, you could take this one.
Yeah, no, this would be a good one for Rowan to pick up as well
Yeah.
after. I'd say as with anything, like the change management is super important. It's not just sort of saying here's an agent, go. Like if you have hundreds of agents, you got to know what are they doing. Are they correctly equipped to do the job, so to speak, right? If you're using sort of the anthropomorphic term, do they have the right skills? Do they have the right entitlements? And then do they have the right management? Right. And so we call it governance, but again, sort of making sure that you have the right tool for the right job and you have the right agent for the right job and making sure that, here is what you have to interact. So I think there is, uh, especially in the enterprise, as we move from sort of a single agent that does stuff, you're going to have these agents start talking to each other, just like how we, as a human workforce, we do a bunch of things. We are experts at a bunch of things and have abilities to do certain jobs, but then we have to work with others. So I think that that's going to start coming, and so it's super important that we think about the governance framework for doing that, and then also a platform to make sure that you can implement all these governance changes. I think a lot of that is sort of being worked out, but there are platform vendors that actually do help you support those governance capabilities. So I think I think the final answer hasn't been written yet, but I think it starts with sort of knowing what they are, and I think I wanted to get Rowan's take because this idea of like everyone building their own agents is sort of interesting. It's certainly super important to do the learning and start getting native to what they're capable of. But really, they're unlikely to be sustainable if everyone's doing their own thing and doing it slightly differently, and you really don't know what's going to happen. So I think at some point it's going to be like, hey, look, these are, these are the employees, and these are the approved vendors, and these are this is what you use them for. I think that work is coming, and that's I don't think it's going to take very long for those concepts to be mainstream in enterprise. Rowan, I'd love to get your take on this.
Yeah, I think I agree with you overall. I think there's a couple of different challenges right now. I think, overall, there's the challenge of everybody creating agents all over the place. And then we, end up with essentially like agent ghost towns or agent graveyards where, you'll look at, and this is why it's very important to have these monitoring and governance tools. You'll look at like the agents that have been created in the past month, and there might be, 4 or 5 thousand agents in there, but how many have actually been run in the past week? How many are run daily? Maybe it's like 10 or 20 or something like that. And so are you actually like keeping an eye on all those other agents and shutting them down when they're not used, or maybe some of those are only used once a quarter because they're for a very specific task, so you should keep them up. And so, like you said, I think it's still being sort of determined how exactly that governance works, because then there's also the piece of this about, or also the piece around this that focuses on ephemeral agents. So there's some, agentic architectures and some approaches where you have an orchestrator agent that might use, pre-existing tools and agents, but also might, create a new agent workflow as part of the execution of their task. And if you have these ephemeral agents, how are you governing those? Is that like governed the same way, or like they just logged as like, a log from like an interaction? You don't actually keep the agent itself. That I think, is another layer to the governance question here that hasn't been fully baked into how enterprise handle this in their process. Um, then there's, and I have to say, like when I look at the market overall, most of these sort of monitoring and governance tools are quite good at kind of seeing like what the overall, set of agents is that is available to the enterprise. Where I think, we really need to start pushing the technology is a more hierarchical view of how agents are interacting. And some folks are starting to move down this road with not just being able to like look at a list of agents, but being able to look at, say, uh, something like a Sankey diagram to say like this agent connects to all of these other agents and like has these dependencies and whatnot in a management kind of context rather than having to like look through each tool call and each individual agent. So I think this also like goes along like with the testing and evaluation side of this, and I think that's one big thing for enterprises to recognize is that governance, testing, and evaluation used to be kind of like a bit separate types of disciplines, and we're really seeing them start to blend much more tightly in the agentic space. But again, there's a lot of need for more tooling around this because it's quite difficult to operate on these new paradigms with existing tools.
Yeah, maybe I'll just one last word on that, and then we can give it back to Vika. The other thing is like, I can imagine things like, I'd love you to think about hierarchical because, the way we organize people is like through org charts and sort of
Hmm.
hierarchies of that, and then sort of saying, hey, look, this is what, this is the entitlements that you'd have at this level, and here are the tools that you
Hmm.
get, and so I can certainly imagine us sort of building out a system where we really have, tagging agents with certain occupations, and here
Hmm.
for these occupations you need access to these tools, and then can they make their own agent on the fly or not? I think it's a really good, fascinating space, and I think it's super important to think about. Most people haven't run into those yet because they're like sort of problems at scale,
Yeah,
but we are sort of looking a little further ahead. But sort of starting to think about from a change management perspective, how do you think about these questions, and then how are you going to implement these things? I think those are all good questions to think through right now. Vika?
agreed.
We're coming up right at time, but I'll ask you one final question here. Um, so what do I tell my CISO who's worried about adding more agents, that will make our systems less secure?
I mean,
Yeah.
I'll start off with this. I would say adding more agents per se is not going to make your systems less secure. It's what are you connecting the agents to and what are you permissioning them to do and who has access to those agents. So I think, for your CISO organization, the main thing that I would think about is the data access side of this. And I've seen this, happen in a number of different organizations when you're connecting, let's say, a vendor provided platform that already looked at a bunch of your content and documentation to an AI tool that can all of a sudden expose a ton of information that you did not realize was exposed. And I'll give this sort of quick example. So you might have a document that you are sharing with the rest of your team, but you might need to share with some other people otherwise. You say, I'm going to share this with everybody in my organization who has a link. And you're like, okay, somebody on a random team is not going to know with this link. It's, security by obscurity, obviously not the best approach, but that's what a lot of folks do. When you have a AI-driven retrieval tool that can look across all of these things, it becomes much easier to find information that you thought was obscured from the rest of the organization or from specific teams that might not be actually. So what I've seen, actually former CISOs who are now CIOs do in this circumstance is essentially run a security audit across their content and then start to say, okay, what agents can we build on top of this? And starting from the perspective of just do the same permissioning and identity access management with the agents that you would do in any other type of application, and don't worry, or sorry, don't try and conceptualize like an agentic identity as your first step.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. For me, having said that, like the agent identity, I think is coming up more and more, where
Oh,
people are
agreed.
saying,
Yes.
so
Sorry. Yes.
yeah,
I wasn't trying to say it's not coming up
yeah.
at all. I was just saying that might be not the
It,
first thing to worry
it's certainly
about for these teams.
it's
Yeah.
certainly not the first step. I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
even in simple, even before agents, even with RAGs, we had this problem, which is like, hey, look, I want to talk to, my docs and I want to ask questions of it, but then it's processed data from multiple folders that have different permissions. And, most systems don't have capabilities to sort of, ACL the embeddings. And so
Yeah.
you sort of had this sort of disclosure. So I think it is important that the CISO does have sort of like a plan to like audit and sort of figure out what the platform and what are the capabilities that there, but they're not intrinsically more unsafe. I think you just have to do the same work. Like if you just deploy OpenClaw as it is, with access to your enterprise, that is unsafe, and you should be able to sort of not do that. And then sort
Mhm.
of, then you have to think through what are the mitigations for the problems you've found. So yeah, I would say like any other piece of software, look at the different constructs and making sure. I think data is super important. The other one is sort of access to APIs. Like a lot of these
Mhm.
agents are supposed to be
Yeah.
doing activities. Do they have the right access, and are they, do they have access to delete the email or code base versus like update and create new files? I think those are the
Mhm.
kinds of problems you need to think through up front.
Okay. Well, with that, I feel like I learned a lot today. I don't think we'll have time to get to all the questions, but we're happy to follow up with folks directly. So thank you for joining us. Venki, Rowan, thanks for your time and insights today. And have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Guys, it's
Thanks,
great to be with
everyone.
y'all today. Have a
Thanks,
good
Ron.
one.